morning. As you know from our announcements, Deacon Doug Flynn, he's from St. Peter's Parish. He works at the diocese. I'm not sure what your official title is, sort of the bishop's right-hand man. I know his office is very close to the bishop's, right next door, I think. So maybe I'll let you give you a little more of a background on who he is. So thank you, Doug.
Can everybody hear me if I wander around like this? It's just, I was a professor at the Air Force Academy for 3 or 4 years, and so I got in the habit of walking around the classroom so that the cadets wouldn't fall asleep. And so I apologize in advance for that bad habit, but I wanted to thank Brian and Ed for inviting me to be here. Start with the true confessions. Ed asked me, would you be willing to come and speak to Laity Engaging Laity? And I said, well, the only thing that I had any real background in that I would feel comfortable talking about would be medical ethics, hence the discussion about medical ethics. And that's just based on my background in the military. When I was at the academy, I taught a course on medical ethics. When I was later at the law firm of Sherman and Howard, a lot of my clients were healthcare entities, Memorial Hospital, Pikes Peak Hospice and Palliative Care. And so I got involved in a lot of real life issues, and more from the legal standpoint than the ethical standpoint. But then having gone through, just talking to Patty, what was 5 years of what was supposed to be a 4-year process to become a deacon, we talked about a lot of moral theology and medical ethics issue. And so in that process, I ended up being invited to sit on the ethics committee for Penrose Hospital and give presentations to the ethics committee at Memorial Hospital. So I thought, okay, I can sign up for that. And this was probably, 3 or 4 months ago, Ed? I can at least do that. I can put something together to cover that. And I met Brian in the hallway at the offices one day, and Brian said, no, you need to be much broader than that. We need to talk about living ethically and morally in the world today. So, there's a challenging topic, and as Brian said, it is pretty big. So I am going to try and talk about 3 different challenges, I think, that we face in the world today. And through the lens of our consciences is going to be the touch note throughout all of these. And one's going to be sort of an international issue, if you will, and one will be one at the national level, and then I'll finish with something pretty close to home here in our own healthcare systems. And I've really, although it's titled catechesis, my approach to you is really not to come to you with answers, but to come to you with questions and challenges, because that's what we face in the world today. And it's pervasive. When I ask myself that first question, how do we live ethically and morally in the world today, my first answer was, God, it's getting harder and harder and harder. Because I think society, and another caveat, I'm going to talk about some very contentious issues, and I don't bring them to you as issues that we're going to solve or maybe even discuss, but as questions of how do we respond to this situation as Catholics? How do our consciences and how does our faith inform us and form us to respond to the reality of our world today? Because I think the reality is there's a society that would very much like to push religion aside and to push it out of the public arena and say, your religion, that's fine. Whatever you believe, that's fine. But you do that on Sunday, or you do that, in the privacy of your own home. But don't talk to us about that when it comes to education, or don't talk to us about that when it comes to health care. And so it really is a challenge. And I think as difficult as it is to talk about consciences, and I'm not here to tell you what conscience is, but we all have it. And just to follow up on what Sue said on how the Holy Spirit leads us and guides us, I had a beautiful, beautiful quote from the Catechism that I was going to bring with me, and I know exactly where it is, right on the dresser on the way out of my house. So you're going to get worse. You're going to have to get my impression of what the Catechism said. But you can write it down if you want the real deal, because it's paragraph 1776. It's easy enough that I can remember it bicentennially, or starting in our country, so I thought it was appropriate. But the gist of what I took away from that verse of the Catechism is it's the silent voice that's not us, that speaks to us in our hearts. And it helps form us and tell us whether we're on the right path, whether we're doing what God wants us to do. Deacon Pat Badon, many of you may know, was part of the formation class, so I blame him ultimately. If I do anything wrong as a deacon, well, you should have told me. But he used to always say, his personal conscience was, when I take a step in the wrong direction, I immediately know I'm going in the wrong direction. And that might take me 10 or 20 or 30 minutes or miles of walking in that direction before I decide to turn around and come back, but that's what conscience is. And we're bound to follow it. We're bound to form it and to follow it, and it's a lifelong journey. So, some of you may know, for a long time, many, many years, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has run a program to serve the victims of human trafficking. So, human trafficking is a real problem, especially with children around the world. And at least for the last 6 years, they have been funded by a grant from Health and Human Services to do that work. And they've created partnerships around the country. Their kind of response has been, anytime, anywhere, whatever the need is, we're going to help these victims. So they've got child care agencies, they've got homeless shelters, they've got healthcare agencies that they can refer victims to. And it's worked, by all accounts, very, very well. Unfortunately, within the last year, for whatever reason, and I don't pretend to know, so this is, and you need to know I hate politics more than anything in the world, so I try to stay out of it. But for whatever reason, Health and Human Services decided they were going to make a change in how they awarded this grant process. And instead of being more like a government contract, where you put it out for bid and you select the best value and it's sort of a competitive process, they wanted to go to more of a partnering approach. And as part of this partnering approach, they said that they would favor or look more favorably on institutions that offered the full, what they called the full range of women's health legal issues. And what that meant, as you probably can guess, is the USCCB efforts through their department would not refer any of these victims to get abortions or provide contraceptive services to them. And so the way it shook out this year was, even though on the scoring system the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had the highest score, they were not selected, and the HHS selected 3 other agencies with not as good track records, and I don't want to get into comparing apples and oranges and things like that, but the USCCB was understandably upset because they said, we can provide the best services to these victims, and we have, and we got the track record. And they really felt like, the bishops did, that they were being discriminated against because of their religious beliefs. And it brought up to me, I don't know if it brought it to them, the question of how do you balance that? So we're going to talk about conscience throughout the morning here at both an institutional level and at a personal level. Okay? Because it's, to some extent, we all have to make these decisions and follow our consciences as individuals. But, especially in the healthcare, and I've learned one thing in healthcare over the years, it's way more complicated than anybody knows. You can't provide healthcare to people without systems in place, without institutions. And so the first question I'm going to pose is, let's assume that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops can provide the best services to these victims of human trafficking. And they have to make the choice. Are you going to get out of that business entirely? Or are you going to compromise on something, or try to find a compromise that says, well, we're not going to provide abortions, obviously, ever, or contraception. We're not going to hand out, contraceptives. But maybe we can find a way to allow somebody else to do that. We're going to refer them to somebody else. How do you balance the good that you could do against what your conscience and what your morals and what natural law tells you are absolute goods and evil? So that's the first issue I'm going to leave you with. We're always going to have plenty of time for questions and answers and stuff, but at any point, if you have questions, clarification, don't hesitate to raise your hand. It's much better for me if it's a dialogue than a monologue. So, at the national level, if you thought that was contentious or controversial, I'm going to dare to try and talk about comprehensive healthcare reform. because it's another area where the bishops of our country for years have been saying we have to find a better way to provide health care to the poor, to the marginalized, to those who are the poorest amongst us. And the good part is I think there are systems in place now that are at least geared to try to do that. And the tough part that probably know if you've read any of the papers or seen the internet for the last couple of years, the bishops were put in a position where they had to say, I don't think we can support this as it is, because it may force people to act on an individual level as doctors or healthcare providers, or on a system level, our healthcare plans, to support things that we don't support. So the issue again becomes on an individual level. If I know that I have to pay money, taxes, healthcare benefits, premiums, whatever, for a program that is going to be providing abortions to people, on demand, what do I do? What are my choices? Am I going to say, okay, I'll go without health care? Well, there might be penalties for that too. But, as a father of 4, how do I make that call if that were the only option? So again, the point is I think we're trying to put in place these protections for conscience at an individual level and at a systematic level. But it's hard. The culture out there, more and more it seems like, wants to say, no, you can't follow your conscience, or you shouldn't, or you should compromise your conscience. And this was an issue that really divided the Catholic community in some ways. I don't know if you said the Catholic Health Association basically answered that question in the affirmative and said the good of providing health care to the poor and to the needy and a broader range of uninsured and underinsured people outweighs the potential downside that maybe some funds somewhere might be used to procure abortions or to provide things that go against what our faith teaches us is right. So that's the second question that we'll talk about. And then the last one, if you thought it couldn't get any more contentious, has to do with our healthcare systems right here in town. And as many of you know, Memorial, right now we have two major systems. Each have 2 hospitals here, right? One's run by Centura, a faith-based management company, and both of the hospitals here are owned really by Catholic health initiatives. So they're Catholic hospitals. And Memorial Hospital, from all accounts, and everybody I've spoken to who's in the system, it's just not tenable anymore to be run through the bureaucracy of a city government as an enterprise. And people realize that for many, many years, but it's kind of come to a head now, and they're going to have to make a choice. And again, I told you I hate politics, so if I get my facts wrong, facts don't matter. You change the facts, I'll change my advice or my answer. So, but I think there were 5 proposals that were put forward to the city that eventually, one or more, may be voted on by us as citizens in this local community. And 2 of those 5 were, to a greater or lesser extent, Catholic organizations. I think the Sisters of Leavenworth, Sisters of Charity from Leavenworth, who run a hospital in the west side of the state, and maybe run some in Denver, put in a bid or a proposal to take over Memorial. And then Centura Health System, it wasn't really a bid to take over, it was more of they support an independent nonprofit, locally run, and then wanted to do some partnership. So, and then there's some for-profit entities, there's a University of Colorado, or there's a university-type entity. But at the end of the day, and I told the CEO at Centura, I said, there's no way this society would allow all 4 major hospitals in a city like ours to be run by Catholics. And he kind of looked at me like, but I saw the legislative maneuvering that went on when one hospital in Denver tried to make the switch from a not-for-profit general to a Catholic-owned hospital, and the legislators were up in arms. They pulled out a lot of tricks to try and stop that transfer from happening, because there's a lot of people out there who are really anti-Catholic, and some are more open about it than others, but we as Catholics, for our faith, are under attack. And I think a lot of people don't realize, they look at it as this one monolithic block. They don't realize, no, the Catholic faith is pretty wide. And reasonable minds can differ on a lot of things. And how do you answer these questions? And so that really is what we get to the heart of in this conscience issue. that was sort of the institutional local level. And at the other local level, there are many, many faithful Catholics I know who work at Memorial Hospital. But each day, I mean, some of them have shared with me, each day they go in and they wonder. I work in, the surgeon told me, I work in the emergency room. I save lives of people who don't have money. They couldn't pay for, the surgery that I do every day. And I think that's God's work, and I think that, he says, I think that's what I'm called to do. But I struggle also every day knowing that down the hall or in another office somewhere, there could be other doctors who are performing abortions. So how does he balance? Is he, by being part of a system that provides that, is he somehow endorsing or materially supporting abortion? So again, it hits us at the individual conscience level, and it hits us at the institutional level. And I think, rather than keep going through details and things like that, I'd rather open it up now and ask your feedback or your thoughts, questions certainly, on any of those issues. Hopefully they're broad enough and people have opinions on them enough that we can start some dialogue now, and then we'll carry this on in small groups and things like that. But what questions do you have, or what phrases have I said that either irk you or pique your curiosity or lead you to ask questions of yourself? Yeah.
When you were talking about the doctor who tries to save lives and is pro-life, and yet knows that down the hall there are people who are not pro-life, I think it's important to be a witness in the place that you are, in the workplace. No workplace is perfect, and if you remain faithful, even within the room in the hospital where you work, that is a witness to those doctors who are doing something else down the hall, so that if all the pro-life people were to leave in good conscience because they can't stand to be in a hospital that aborts babies, then who's left in that hospital except people who abort babies? And I've always felt that as a Christian, as a Catholic, it's our purpose to be witnesses in the world as it is, in an effort to change what it is. And if we kind of turn and run from something that's evil, which is our natural tendency, no one wants to live, work in a place that's evil, then that witness is lost. I think of how many Christians are leaving the Middle East and Jerusalem and Bethlehem and all the places that are dear to our spiritual heritage. And I understand why they're leaving, but the witness itself speaks volumes to those who are there. And I understand the dilemma, but I also think that even one story of a pro-life doctor in a pro-choice hospital makes a difference.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's exactly the way a couple of the docs that I've spoken to over there feel. They're like, we're doing good, and we are a light in the darkness to some extent. And they don't proselytize. They're not trying to convert people except by their witness and by their example. And I think that's a lot of what Lady Engaging Lady is calling us to do.
Yeah, I think Charlene really hit it on the head. You're right as to what Lady Engaging Lady is all about, is living our faith in the society wherever we find ourselves, whether it's work or school or family or wherever, and making a difference by how we live. That was a very good point. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it is really what we're all about.
I want to add to that we make an assumption as Catholics that these Catholic doctors are praying for the rest of the hospital. That's where I think a place of consciousness really is, in the sense that if I am being a nurse, if I'm in that hospital setting and I see what's happening around me that I might consider less than good, then as a real witness, not only to be there, but to be prayerful and to ask God for His grace to convert and transform the people that I'm in relationship in my workplace. And I think that's often where we miss the mark, Because we as Christians, as Catholic Christians, if we aren't transformed enough to have a deep prayer life ourselves, we don't have that to bring. And I really think that in these situations, we really have to say it's God's grace. It's God's grace moving through me, moving through all of us that can change things. It's not just us being present, it's us praying for grace to move here and to allow other consciousnesses to see.
It's beautiful, and it brought to mind one of the we're gonna have to paraphrase again. One of the beautiful things that I loved in the Rule of Saint Benedict was over and over he said people undervalue or underestimate the power of prayer. And when he was talking about how do you deal with things within the monastery, struggles within the monastery, there were a lot of very logistical, bright steps on how you confront people and do things. At the end he said, and if none of that works, then you pull out the big guns and you pray. So I couldn't agree more and we're called to do that on an individual level. The other thing I wanted to say was so much of being a witness, people are afraid to cross over that line of proselytizing and saying, this is what our Catholic faith teaches. A great deal of what our Catholic faith teaches is part of the natural law. It's universal. Even if, the church didn't exist, it still would be wrong to kill. And so, I think the more we can be positive in spreading the good news of Jesus Christ, but also what the natural law tells us about what's good and what's evil and what's right and what's wrong, I had to compliment again because Sue's wonderful exercise. She put quotes in there on excellent stuff about choosing life, and the more we can talk about the life of the most precious and those who don't have voices to speak for themselves, I think that's another example of being a witness where you don't have to feel like you're shoving your faith down somebody's throat. You're just talking about, think about the baby, and can we save both? And these we'll really get into. I don't know what Ed has planned, but God forbid you ask me to come up with a scenario, because this is where the rubber hits the road, right? This is where the really difficult questions happen, and how when it's life and death. And it happens at the beginning of life, happens during life, it happens at the end of life. And when I gave the presentation, I was pretty nervous at the Memorial Health System, so I wasn't sure what they were expecting. But there was Nathan, the head of the chaplains over there, just said, well, come tell us about the ethical and religious directives. Okay. Nope. But really, I wanted to read this little section here. And those of you who work in Catholic health systems are probably very familiar with this. But it's not like the Catechism that gives us such beautiful guidance and such deep wisdom. I think everything in this book, if you have questions about beginning of life, end of life, it's beautiful because each section starts with a reflection on why do we believe this. And then it has to, by necessity, get into the more thou shalt not, the more prescriptive things. But that was one of the things a few revisions ago that was really helpful. Instead of just saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you shouldn't do that, you should go this way, it gave a lot of scriptural and moral explanation as to why do we say that, why do we not permit that. So in the introduction, basically, the bishop said, in a time of new medical discoveries, rapid technological developments, and social change, what is new can either be an opportunity for genuine advancement in human culture, or it can lead to policies and actions that are contrary to the true dignity and vocation of the human person. In consultation with medical professionals, church leaders review these developments, judge them according to principles of right reason and the ultimate standard of revealed truth, and offer authoritative teaching and guidance about the moral and pastoral responsibilities entailed by the Christian faith. So they update these periodically as new technologies, but as Sue said, it changes so fast. And if you don't have a sound grounding in what the moral and what the philosophical and what the natural law says, you don't even have a bedrock to kind of address the new technology that's coming out. And we see it in communications, the legal system falls behind as well. They can't keep up with how do you keep privileged emails when once you send it out, anybody can send it out? So it's not unique to the healthcare or the medical ethics issue, but this is where the rubber hits the road, because this is life and death. And a lot of times at different levels, individually and institutionally, we have to choose.
Doug?
Yes?
A friend of mine, this is back in the 80s, a friend of mine in upstate New York was a surgeon, and he had a partnership, 2 other doctors, and he became convinced as a Catholic doctor that he needed to make a statement about how to live his faith. And he approached his partners who were performing probably 2 or 3 abortions a year. And over a course of several months, he attempted to persuade them that that was not a service that they should be offering. He tried to convince them. I don't know that proselytize is the right word, but he was convinced. And he tried to convince them. And they couldn't see it. So he left that practice, and he left the hospital where these abortions were taking place. And this is not a large city in upstate New York. It was kind of more of a small town, but he was obviously a very successful man, house on the lake. He bought a storefront down in town, and he handled then, as a general practitioner, he provided medical care for the poor, the elderly, those who would walk in off the street. That's a different response, from what others might have. And I don't tell that story to say that's the right response, but it was the right response for him. He felt called to try to convince his partners. They weren't convinced, and it was not an easy decision for him to make, as you can imagine. But that was what he did in terms of witnessing to his faith.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think when you talk about we need systems, we do need systems, but I think it's the systems that get us into trouble. And we try to make too much out of the systems because we're trying to please too many different people, and we're doing systems for systems' sake and not necessarily for the people that are involved, or not looking at the whys. You know, I think this is a great system, but can I tell you why? Most of the time, no. And I think that happens in a lot of things, but that's not the main thing I wanted to say. That was just something that came to me. And I'm a big believer in systems, but I see where they've gotten us into a lot of problems. The thing that I have most problem with understanding is the double effect. And I know that I've been called on at times to explain this to others, and I really feel that there's more education or more understanding of it needed.
I couldn't agree more. Now, how many of you know what Nancy's talking about in the principle of double effect? It's a moral theological principle. I figured that this was going to come up. Because again, the academic in me wants to have my book on moral theology and you know, the videotapes that I had to listen to ad nauseum from the Augustine Institute. But I'll give you my best shot at it, okay? And this will not fill the catechesis piece of this part. So the principle of double effect, essentially, and I won't be able to go through all of the points for you, but what it means is, if your primary intent is to do something good, your first intent is to do something good, it recognizes that in some situations that can have harmful side effects, and that's okay. I think where people get into trouble is, well, how do you decide what your primary effect is? And I'll use the controversial situation in Phoenix because I don't know anything about it. So it's all hypothetical. I mean, I know probably what I've read and what you have, but I don't know what the facts are as far as what the actual diagnosis was, what the actual risks were. But it's the hardest case scenario, and it's the question of a woman who's has a pregnancy, and it's not a viable fetus, you can't deliver it, and all the medical technology or all the medical diagnoses say one of those two, either the mother or the child, is going to die. That's the end result. And if you don't do anything, both will die. So, I mean, that's sort of how the philosophers would like to, they always do the hypothetical questions in the worst case scenarios. And the question is, if your ultimate goal is to save the mother's life, can you do that by performing an abortion? And where it gets tricky is, or where I sometimes get confused, is you have to look at the action that you're doing, the action that you're performing. It's not the ends justify the means. It's what's the objective morality of the act you're performing. I'm going to leave that for a second and come back to one that was helpful for me to understand. And it's a little different, but it's in the issue of sterilization and ectopic pregnancies. And there are two medical procedures that are possible. And an ectopic pregnancy, again, showing my medical ignorance, so some of the nurses can help me if I'm wrong. But where for whatever reason, the fertilized egg has not moved down where it's supposed to be and gets stuck in the fallopian tube, and as it grows, it's going to rupture and potentially kill the mother. Well, it causes problems within the fallopian tube. And so in one of these procedures, surgeons can go in and they can remove the fallopian tube. And if their primary goal is to treat that situation or that medical necessity, it's going to kill the mother, and the unintended consequence, but logical consequence, is the embryo that's there, or the fertilized egg that's there, is not going to live, that's permissible. This was what shocked me, because another procedure that's available, as I understand it, again from friends who are doctors, is now technology has advanced to the point where you can go in and you can surgically slice open a small part of the fallopian tube and, cottage or scraping or whatever, remove the fertilized egg and save the fallopian tube. I mean, the woman could have more children. And what moral theologians or what ethicists, I guess, will tell you is the first one is permissible because your intent is treating a disease. And the unintended consequence is the embryo is going to be destroyed. But the other, your intent is to go in and destroy the embryo. And so that's never permitted. And that just boggled my mind, and it took me a long time to get my arms around it, but that's what I mean when I say you have to look at what the action is that you're doing for that first question, not what your ultimate intent is. And I think, based on what I know of the situation in Phoenix, is that was part of the problem. Is they were looking at the ultimate good of saving a woman's life, but the actual act that they decided to authorize or endorse was the intentional killing of another human life. And I'll leave you with one last thought on this and the principle of double effect, and it's from Father Tad, who I can't pronounce his last name, but he's a pretty famous ethicist priest, and it was in the Catholic Herald in one of his articles, but he said, by way of analogy, you've got the burning building, okay? A beam has fallen down and crushed a child, but that's the only way in, and there's a mother or there's 10 people inside the room behind. So there's a lot of things you can do. You can try and pull the beam off. You can try and get in through other way. There's a lot of morally permissible ways to try and save those lives, but the one thing you can't do is take a chainsaw and cut up the child in order to get through that opening. It's like, ooh, okay. A little gory, but I think it got, for me anyway, it got the point across. So I hope that helps a little bit. And how are we doing on time? Why don't we just go maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we'll take a quick break and then move into small groups, if that... Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you saw last night, anyone on 2020, they had a report on India where there are now whole villages that have no women because Indians don't want baby girls. They want boys. And so now they've been doing this for a while, and now they have entire villages that are just men, and these men have grown up, and now there's no one to marry, no one to have children with. And not that you'd want girl children, but still. And so they are reaping the harvest of what they have sown. in being, pro-boy, anti-girl. They're calling it gendercide instead of genocide. So that they see the result of this fanaticism about having boys at the expense of girls. They kill them, they give them away, whatever they have to do to get rid of them. And now they realize, oh yeah, it would be kind of nice to have some women. I guess they didn't consider that little baby girls grow up to be women. So that the consequences of our actions have really become apparent to these people. And now they're starting to change the laws, because now these men have no one to marry, and God forbid a man should not get what he wants. And so now there's this whole legal push towards getting this done and making it, quote, illegal to abort a baby girl. And so I think, though, for many of these pro-life issues, they will not change until people see the consequences of their actions, and I don't think it's going to be as apparent in these other situations as it is in India.
Right.
But we do tend to act when things no longer become beneficial, advantageous to us to be pro-choice. When it's no longer advantageous to be pro-choice, people will become pro-life.
Well, I didn't see that, but I know what you're talking about, and I think that's an extreme example. But in a lot of places, in China, they have government policies over how many children you can have, and sometimes it's cultural, right? In Europe, a lot of, you hear about people waiting longer and longer to have families and having fewer and fewer children. And again, I'm not a demographer any more than I'm a medical professional, but things that I've read talk about in a lot of those areas, it's going to take longer, but over maybe not one generation, but 2 or 3, the population's not even having enough children to replenish itself. And so that plays out in the demographics where you don't have young people coming up to do the work, but you have old people who are living longer because of our medical breakthroughs, who need care. And the fear, I think for me and for a lot of folks, is there may not be enough people to help us when we need the help. So again, it's a little more subtle and overlooked, but the problem is the same. You've got what I would judge as short-sighted government response to a problem that's going to create much more. It goes to your question of the system, and I'll leave you with one last catechetical piece. But one of the things that I've learned in Catholic social teaching that I maybe knew at some level, but hadn't really appreciated the benefit of, was the principle of subsidiarity, which is really you should deal with things at the lowest possible level. So if it's something that Ed and I can work out between us, we should do that. We shouldn't have to go to the diocese or our healthcare system or whatever to answer something if we can do it effectively on our own. And so I tell parishes this and pastors this all the time. This is really an issue for you to work out within your parish. I know you'd like somebody to step in and settle this squabble, but that's a parish issue. That's not really a diocesan issue, or certainly not a Vatican issue, although we still have people write to the Pope and see what stuff. So. Any other last things to do? And we'll come back again at also a large group too, right? So we can process some of the small.
Yes, indeed, we will indeed.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that I really, thank you guys for bringing this topic up, because I think it's an important topic, and especially in our society today, where our society is more sanitized. There's a lot of things we can't say in the workplace, we can't say it in the community, we can't say it in some hospitals. And so as a Catholic, how do I live that out? How do I know where those boundaries are? Watching TV and the TV programs, the lines can get blurred very easily. And so I liked what Charlene was saying and what Patty was saying. I think, the first place is prayer. But again, trying to live that out, and you're talking about Benedict, St. Francis, I liked how he said it, preach the gospel. And when necessary, use words.
Amen. Amen. Well, I'll just leave you with my last thought, which is I think betrays my mistrust of all things institutional or governmental, but I think where we make a difference is at the personal level. and it's the ones and the twos and the threes. It's the story Ed told of the doctor with his two partners. There are some people who are called to go change the world and change, the laws and change the systems. But I think, the best way to change hearts is one person at a time. And that's the situation where if somebody asks you or you see that they're struggling with something, that you're called first and foremost to live out your Catholic faith, to share that with them. And God bless you if you're called to change Centura Health or some huge system like that. But my last pithy quote was, at the end of the day, Republicans and Democrats and Centura Health and whatever, pick an institution, that they can't go to confession. Only individuals could go, and that's from a change in their heart. If you change enough of those hearts, then the institution will change. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sticking around. I'm not going anywhere. So